Okay, let's unpack this and dive deep. Welcome, everyone, to the deep dive.
Hello.
We've pulled together a stack of sources for you today, all pointing towards one incredibly important, vital, and, yes, currently very threatened ecosystem, the Great Salt Lake.
It really is more than just, a vast pool of salty water on the map. It's a dynamic, complex system.
Yeah,
And as our sources make clear, it has impacts reaching far, far beyond Utah's borders.
absolutely. And our mission in this deep dive is to really get to grips with the key challenges it's facing, particularly the dramatic swings in its water levels and salinity.
Right.
Then we're going to zoom in on a specific piece of that complex puzzle, how the mineral extraction industry operates here, how it interacts with the lake's water, and how, recent policy changes are attempting to manage that relationship.
And we've drawn insights from quite a range of sources, from environmental advocacy groups that have been working on this for decades, to cutting-edge university research, and even, surprisingly, an article from a water bottle company, of all things, that delves into the complexities of the mineral market.
Really?
Yeah, it's a pretty rich tapestry of information we've got.
It really is. And as we explore these sources, we'll uncover some really striking connections, like how the fate of millions, literally millions, of migratory birds depends on tiny brine shrimp in this hypersaline environment,
It's incredible.
and how a shrinking lake bed could trigger dangerous dust storms with huge public health implications.
Yeah, that's a scary one.
And also how an unprecedented wave of legislative action is attempting to reroute water and rethink how industries interact with this critical resource. It's quite a story of ecological importance, economic forces, public health risks, and really rapid policy shifts.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. Let's get into it.
Okay, so starting with the star of the show, the Great Salt Lake itself, it holds some pretty significant titles on a global scale, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It's recognized as the largest saltwater lake in the Western Hemisphere. And, importantly, it's the 8th largest terminal lake in the world.
Okay, let's pause on that word terminal. What exactly does terminal mean in the context of a lake? I think people might not be familiar with that.
Good point. Think of it this way. Water flows into it, but there's no natural outlet for the water to flow out to a river or another lake or the ocean.
Ah, okay.
The major rivers feeding the Great Salt Lake are the Bear, Weber, Ogden, and Jordan rivers. They bring in fresh water, but the only way water actually leaves the lake is through evaporation.
Ah, okay. So the sun basically acts as the only drain. And I imagine that process of water leaving, but everything dissolved in it staying behind, is what makes it so salty.
Precisely. Exactly. As the water evaporates into the atmosphere, it leaves behind all the salts and minerals that the inflowing rivers have carried from the surrounding landscape over millennia. Over time, these concentrate, and that results in the high salinity the lake is known for. And, different sections of the lake separated by a causeway can actually have very different salinity levels depending on freshwater inflow and evaporation rates in that specific part.
Got it. And physically, while it covers this vast area, sources say it can be up to, 75 miles long and 35 miles wide. It's also remarkably shallow, which I found kind of surprising.
It is, yeah. Despite its immense surface area, the deepest points are only around 33 feet.
Just 33 feet.
Yeah, which makes it incredibly sensitive to fluctuations in the amount of water flowing in versus the amount evaporating. A relatively small change in the actual volume of water can lead to a really dramatic change in its surface area and its depth.
Which means it's inherently dynamic, always changing shape almost.
Exactly. It's often described as constantly breathing, expanding during wet cycles, and then receding dramatically during dry periods.
Right.
This natural dynamism has historically made it resilient. However, the sources really underscore that in recent decades, the combination of, rapidly growing human population and the associated increase in water demands
For everything, yeah.
for agriculture, cities, industry, coupled with the impacts of climate change driving hotter, drier conditions and reduced snowpack runoff, that combination is pushing the lake system beyond its historical limits.
And that's the worry.
That's the worry. This threatens to lead to potentially irreversible ecological and environmental consequences.
That really sets the stage for the crisis the lake has faced recently.
Yeah.
So given its unique characteristics and this vulnerability, why does this lake matter so intensely? What's its critical value, both, locally and even globally?
Its value is profound. And it's multifaceted. Let's start with its ecological significance, which is genuinely global. This is not an exaggeration.
Global. Okay, tell me more. How so?
The Great Salt Lake is a globally vital habitat. It's one of only a handful of places on Earth that can support the sheer numbers of migratory birds that rely on it. We're talking over 10 million birds annually using it as a critical refueling and resting stop.
Over 10 million birds. That's an almost unimaginable number concentrated in one area.
It really is. And they use it as a crucial stopover point along the eastern spur of the Pacific Flyway, which is a major aerial highway for bird migration in the Western Hemisphere.
What kinds of birds are we talking about? Any specific examples that stand out?
Oh, the diversity is incredible, and the numbers are staggering for certain species. For example, the lake hosts the world's largest staging concentration of Wilson's phalaropes.
Wilson's phalaropes.
Yeah. In one spring day, you can see up to 500,000 of these birds. And what they do here is just astonishing. They literally double their body weight feeding on the lake's resources.
Double their weight.
Double it. To fuel a nonstop flight of over 3,400 miles to their wintering grounds way down in Ecuador or Peru.
Just from this one stop. That is genuinely incredible and speaks volumes about the richness of the food source there.
Absolutely. And it's not limited to phalaropes. More than half of the entire North American population of eared grebes, that's up to 4.7 million birds gather here in the fall.
Wow.
The lake is also home to Earth's largest breeding population of California gulls, and you'll find significant numbers of red-necked phalaropes, iconic American white pelicans, elegant American avocets, just countless other species of shorebirds, waterfowl, and waterbirds, using the lake and its surrounding wetlands for feeding, nesting, wintering.
So what exactly are they feeding on? Is it like fish in the lake?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so salty.
Yeah, that's a common misconception because of the high salinity. The primary food sources are actually salt-loving organisms that are adapted to the briny water. Brine flies and, most famously, brine shrimp.
The brine shrimp.
Those provide the incredibly rich, nutritious food source that allows these birds to fuel their massive migrations or build up reserves for nesting. The entire ecosystem, really, from the microbes and algae that the brine shrimp and flies feed on right up to the millions of birds, it's all interconnected and surprisingly delicate, particularly when salinity levels change dramatically.
So the ecological value is just immense. But that ecosystem, particularly the brine shrimp, isn't just important for birds. It has significant economic value too, right?
It certainly does. The brine shrimp industry based here is substantial. They harvest the dormant eggs, called cysts,
Okay.
which are a global commodity used in aquaculture worldwide. This brings millions of dollars into Utah's economy.
Aquaculture, like fish and shrimp farms. You mean they feed these cysts to baby fish?
Exactly. A healthy brine shrimp resource from the Great Salt Lake is essential as a food source for the larval stages of fish and shrimp raised in aquaculture operations globally.
Huh?
So this provides a vital source of healthy protein for people in both developed and developing countries.
Wow. So the health of this unique lake in Utah is directly tied to seafood production on dinner plates around the world. That's a connection most people probably don't make.
It's a surprising link, isn't it? But a very real one. And then, of course, there's the mineral extraction we'll be focusing on more later. The lake is a significant source of critical minerals.
Right. What kinds of minerals are we talking about there?
Well, minerals like potash, which is a key component in fertilizers used globally, particularly for fruit and nut crops.
Okay.
It's also a source of magnesium. North America's only primary producer of magnesium operates here.
Really? The only one?
The only primary producer, yeah. And magnesium is used in lightweight alloys found in everything from, aluminum cans to computers, phones, even cars. And increasingly, there's a lot of interest in lithium extraction from the brines, too.
Lithium, of course. For battery.
Exactly. So it's not just a local resource. Its output feeds directly into global agricultural and manufacturing supply chains.
It's truly connected globally then.
Precisely. And beyond these major industries, there's also value from recreation and tourism. People visit to boat, birdwatch, or see the iconic Spiral Jetty Land art installation out there.
Right, Spiral Jetty.
And for many in the region, there's the benefit of lake effect snow.
Ah, yes, the famous Utah powder. the lake-effect snow that falls on the Wasatch Mountains and helps fuel the ski industry.
Right. As cold air masses pass over the relatively warmer, salty lake water, they pick up moisture, which then falls as these localized, heavy snowfall bands in the mountains. It's a significant economic driver for the winter sports industry, no question.
So you've got this immense ecological and economic value tied up in the lake, but there's also a stark public health threat
Yeah.
directly linked to the lake shrinking, which is maybe less talked about but potentially huge.
This is a major point of concern highlighted in the sources, yeah. As the lake recedes and exposes more of the lake bed, this fine dust, these fine particles known as PM10, become airborne.
And there's a really grim cautionary tale in the U.S. about exactly this scenario, right?
Right.
Owens Lake in California.
A very clear and devastating example. Owens Lake was largely dried up in the early 20th century due to water diversions to support Los Angeles.
Right, the L.A. aqueduct story.
Exactly. The exposed lake bed became, and still is, one of the largest sources of PM10 pollution in the entire country. And that dust has been linked to serious health problems for residents, like downwind things like increased rates of respiratory illnesses like asthma and bronchitis, heart issues, even cancer.
And addressing that problem has come at an enormous cost, hasn't it?
Just eye-watering. Over $2 billion has already been spent by Los Angeles just on dust mitigation efforts,
$2 billion.
including rewatering parts of the lake bed and other measures. And the thing is, the Great Salt Lake is vastly larger than Owens Lake,
How much larger?
sources say.
16 times larger.
16.
So just try to imagine the potential scale of a dust problem here if the Great Salt Lake were to dry up significantly.
It's terrifying to think about. It is, and research cited in our sources shows that a considerable portion, up to 90% in some studies, of the particulate matter pollution along Utah's populous Wasatch Front already comes from dried lake beds and desert basins in the region.
Wow, 90% from those sources.
Yeah, so keeping water in the Great Salt Lake isn't just about birds or industry. It's fundamentally about protecting the air quality and human health for millions of people who live downwind. It's a preventative measure against potentially devastating future costs and health impacts.
That really hammers home the urgency of the situation.
Yep.
And the lake did indeed hit a record low level just recently in 2022.
It did in November 2022. This followed decades of increased water diversions upstream for cities, industry, agriculture, a trend that was really exacerbated by persistent drought conditions and the intensifying effects of climate change, leading to lower snowpack and higher evaporation rates.
That crisis point, that record low, seems to have been a critical turning point for public and political awareness, though.
Absolutely. It generated widespread public alarm. It catalyzed a surge in new scientific studies to better understand the lake's dynamics and prognosis. And crucially, it finally brought the lake the attention it desperately needed from policymakers in Utah.
But then, after hitting that low point, thankfully, we had a couple of very wet years, thanks to record-breaking snowpack in 2023, and then above-average snow again in 2024. That provided a bit of a reprieve, right?
It provided a crucial, very welcome reprieve. The influx of water from the massive snowmelt significantly boosted lake levels.
How much did the lake levels actually recover? Did the sources give numbers?
They do. According to the data, the south arm of the lake, which is separated by that railroad causeway and had seen the most dramatic drops, it rose by 5.5 feet from its record low in November 2022 to its high point in June 2023.
5.5 feet, okay.
And after accounting for evaporation over the summer and some flow into the north arm, that resulted in a net elevation gain of about 3.5 feet by the end of the water year in 2023. The water year-end elevation for the south arm rose 3 feet compared to 2022.
A 3.5-foot gain on a lake that's only, 33 feet deep at its maximum. That sounds pretty significant in relative terms.
It is, yeah, particularly for ecological health and also for access for industries like mineral extraction. And the spring snowmelt wasn't just about elevation, it was critical for salinity, too.
Ah, right, diluting the salt.
Exactly. The freshwater inflow brought the South Arm's salinity back down to levels that are much healthier for brine shrimp and other life after it had reached dangerously high record levels in 2022. And reservoirs across the basin also saw massive gains, jumping from a concerning 36% capacity to a much healthier 84%.
So a real influx of water across the entire system, buying some crucial time. But the sources are very, very clear that this was a temporary gift from nature, not a long-term fix.
Crucially, yes. While the wet years were an enormous benefit and absolutely prevented immediate collapse, they did not fundamentally solve the underlying problem.
Right.
Lake levels, even after those gains, remain below what scientists and resource managers consider a healthy, sustainable range for the ecosystem and for human uses.
Still too low.
still too low. And Utah still faces the challenge of rapidly growing water demands, a fundamentally limited long-term water supply, and climate change predictions that point towards more frequent and intense periods of drought and hotter, drier conditions in the future.
So the structural challenges of supply and demand, amplified by a changing climate, are still very much in play. The fundamental math hasn't changed.
Exactly. The recent water was like a critical emergency deposit, but the long-term water budget, well, it's still deeply in the red if current trends continue.
Okay, let's take that context now and shift our focus specifically to the mineral extraction industry, as it's such a key piece of the puzzle in our sources today. This industry has a long history at the lake, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Companies have been extracting minerals, primarily nutritional minerals initially, from the Great Salt Lake since way back in 1969.
And our sources identify a few key players involved, particularly those with specific water rights and claims for extracting food-grade minerals.
Right. The main companies mentioned holding those specific rights are Mineral Resources International, Inc., that's MRI, Trace Minerals Research, LLC, or TMR, and Salt Lake Minerals Company, LLC, SLM.
Okay.
But when we look at overall water use for mineral extraction, the largest depleters, the biggest users of water, are Compass Minerals and U.S. Magnesium.
Compass and U.S. Magnesium.
Right. Cargill also operates on the lake, but apparently their brine supply comes from U.S. Magnesium's ponds, so their water usage is effectively counted under U.S. Magnesium's figures in the reports.
Gotcha. So how have they traditionally extracted these minerals from the lake brine? What's the process?
The long-standing traditional method relies heavily on solar evaporation. Basically, companies pump vast quantities of lake brine into these extremely large, shallow ponds built along the lake's edge.
Huge ponds, right?
Huge. Then they simply let the sun and wind do the work, evaporate the water over months or even years. This leaves behind the concentrated salts and minerals, which are then harvested mechanically.
Extremely large ponds seems like an understatement. How much acreage are we actually talking about for these evaporation ponds?
Yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling. Sources indicate that companies like Compass Minerals and U.S. Magnesium alone own and utilize over 110,000 acres of these ponds.
110,000 acres just for evaporation.
Just for evaporation, that's an absolutely massive area of land around the lake dedicated purely to this process.
And the amount of water evaporated from that acreage must be truly significant then.
It is. Mineral extraction's water depletion and depletion means water permanently lost to the atmosphere from these ponds, not returned to the lake it peaked back in 2007.
Okay.
A report from Utah State University cited in the sources puts that peak depletion at 271.3 thousand acre-feet annually.
271.3 thousand acre-feet. Can you put acre-foot into perspective again for us?
Sure. An acre-foot is a standard unit for measuring large volumes of water. It's literally the amount of water it would take to cover 1 acre of land with water 1 foot deep. It's roughly equivalent to about 326,000 gallons. Maybe the amount of water a typical urban household uses in a year or two, depending on location.
So 271.3 thousand acre-feet is a lot of gallons.
It's over 88 billion gallons in that peak year, just evaporated.
88 billion gallons.
Yeah.
Okay, that puts the scale into perspective. And how does the mineral extraction industry's water use compare to the total human water use from the whole basin?
That's a good question for context. Over the period from 1989 to 2021, mineral extraction accounted for about 7.4% of the total human depletion from the Great Salt Lake Basin.
7.4%.
Yeah. So while agriculture and municipal use account for much larger percentages, 7.4% is still a significant chunk of water being permanently removed from the system each year via this evaporative process.
And those low lake levels we discussed earlier, they don't just impact the ecosystem, they directly affect these mineral extraction operations too, don't they?
Absolutely. When the lake shrinks, the brines in certain areas become shallower and much harder to access from their existing intake structures, their pumps.
Right, the water literally moves away from them.
Exactly. This forces companies to undertake very costly operational changes just to keep getting water into their ponds. One source highlighted U.S. Magnesium considering a proposal for a multi-mile extension of their intake canal.
Miles long.
Miles long. A massive infrastructure project just to be able to pump 100,000 gallons per minute from further out in the receding lake.
So the lake's health isn't just an environmental issue for them. It's a fundamental operational and economic challenge. Their business depends on it.
Precisely. It really underscores how dependent the industry is on sufficient lake levels just to physically access the brine resource they need to operate.
Okay. Beyond the traditional methods and water use, the sources also touch on some market dynamics and, intriguingly, questions about product quality.
Yes, the ION8 source, that's the water bottle company source, specifically delves into this aspect. It notes that there are significant barriers for new companies wanting to enter the mineral extraction market at the lake. Things like high capital costs for building the ponds and processing facilities, significant operational liabilities associated with handling brines and waste, and the need for pretty advanced technologies for efficient extraction and purification.
So it's not a simple industry to just jump into.
Not at all. And while companies like MRI use the established solar evaporation method, others, like TMR and SLM, claim to employ more advanced or, quote, superior extraction methods. But the source raises a really critical point about transparency and quality, particularly regarding minerals marketed for human consumption.
Okay, what's the specific concern there? This sounds important.
This is where the source had a particularly eye-opening point, I thought. It states that consumers often lack the ability to differentiate between minerals produced for industrial use, like magnesium for alloys, and those intended for food or nutritional supplements.
Right, how would you know?
Exactly. And here's the crucial part, according to this ION8 source. Currently, there is no state regulatory mechanism in place in Utah that ensures Great Salt Lake harvesters produce minerals suitable and safe for human consumption, even if they market them as food grade.
Wait a minute, let me make sure I heard that right. You're saying that companies can extract minerals from the Great Salt Lake, label them as food grade or nutritional, sell them for people to eat or take as supplements. But there's currently no state oversight or certification process to verify that those minerals actually meet safety standards for people to consume.
That is precisely what this particular source indicates. It highlights a significant potential gap in consumer protection and safety oversight regarding these specific types of products extracted from the lake. It's a major point about market transparency and regulatory responsibility that this source brings up.
That is, yeah, that's a surprising and frankly concerning detail that came out of these sources. Wow. Okay, moving from the established methods and these market issues, the sources also discuss potential future shifts, particularly related to new technologies for mineral extraction, with a big focus on lithium.
This is where we see the potential for a significant change in the industry's relationship with the lake's water. Recent legislation, as we'll discuss more, is explicitly trying to incentivize or even require the use of non-consumptive technologies, basically methods that don't evaporate the water.
Moving away from those huge evaporation ponds.
Right. And there's a specific company mentioned that's proposing a large-scale non-consumptive operation.
Yes, a company called Water Leak Resources, which is apparently a subsidiary of Lilac Solutions, has applied for a substantial amount of water, 225,000 acre-feet annually.
225,000 acre-feet. That's a massive volume, comparable to the historical peak total depletion from all mineral extraction combined back in 2007.
It is, but they claim their method is non-consumptive. How does that work?
That's the core of their proposal and their claim. Their process reportedly involves pumping the brine, using an acid-based method to selectively extract the lithium, and then this is key, neutralizing the remaining water with alkaline additives before discharging it back into the lake.
Ah, okay.
They assert that this process is water neutral, meaning the water is returned to the lake system rather than being lost to evaporation.
So the water goes in, they take out the lithium, they treat the water, and they send it back. No water lost to the atmosphere, theoretically. Sounds good on paper.
That's the theory and promise of the technology, yeah. However, the sources are careful to point out that there are still significant unanswered questions surrounding this novel approach.
Such as?
While there's uncertainty about its efficacy on a large scale, its long-term economic viability, can they actually make money doing this? And critically, its potential ecological impact on the lake's complex chemistry and unique biota after the treated water is returned. What does putting that treated water back do to the lake ecosystem?
Right. So the technology sounds promising for water conservation, definitely, but its real-world impact, especially ecologically, is still basically unknown.
Exactly. And this is why the planned pilot plant, which is scheduled for 2024 out on the North Arm, is so vital.
The pilot plant.
Yeah. It's intended not only to demonstrate the physical and economic feasibility of the technology, but also, perhaps more importantly, to rigorously assess its ecological impacts on the lake environment before they scale it up.
This pilot plant feels like a crucial test then, both for this company specifically and potentially for the entire future direction of mineral extraction at the lake.
Absolutely. If this non-consumptive method proves successful and environmentally sound, it could fundamentally change the calculus for the industry and for the lake. It would certainly make the traditional evaporative methods look increasingly unsustainable in the long term, especially as the imperative to conserve water for the lake's elevation becomes ever more critical.
Which brings us neatly to how Utah has been responding to the lake's crisis through policy and collective action. The severe decline seems to have finally sparked a period of really unprecedented focus.
It really did. That near collapse in 2022 served as a massive wake-up call that crystallized the lake's immense value and the dire consequences of letting it disappear. This prompted leaders across the state to finally prioritize the issue in a way they hadn't before.
And it wasn't just a sudden reaction in 2022. Some groundwork was laid earlier, though perhaps without the same level of urgency we see now.
That's right. There were earlier steps, like the unanimous passage of House Concurrent Resolution 10 back in 2019, which called for scientific studies on the lake's decline.
Yeah.
And the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council released a comprehensive report in 2020 outlining a dozen strategies, including potential changes to water law, conservation incentives, and tools for acquiring water rights specifically for the lake. Funding was also secured in 2021 for things like groundwater studies and improving water planning. These were important foundational steps, kind of setting the stage.
But then, the legislative sessions from 2022 to 2024 are really highlighted in the sources as being transformative, almost revolutionary for Utah water policy.
They are described as delivering a decade's worth of water bills in a single year in 2022.
Wow.
Including once-in-a-generation legislation.
Oh, yeah.
The crisis seemed to finally overcome decades of historical inertia and, frankly, competing interests that had stalled action before.
So what were some of the key types of policy changes enacted during this period that our sources point to? Maybe we can group them by their impact rather than just listing bill numbers, make it easier to follow.
Yeah, that's helpful. One major category of policy focused on actively getting water to the lake, which actually hadn't been legally or practically easy before.
Right. Water for the environment wasn't really a thing.
Exactly. So, for instance, bills created a state-funded water trust and program, the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Program. And this is co-managed by conservation groups like the Nature Conservancy and Audubon. And this program has already facilitated transactions to bring tens of thousands of acre-feet of water. The sources say over 68,000 acre-feet so far to the lake by working cooperatively with existing water rights holders.
So that addresses the volume of water needed, getting water into the lake. And there was also a fundamental change in how water rights themselves work in Utah, right? That sounds huge.
Yes, and this was perhaps one of the most historic shifts. Prior to these bills, Utah's water law operated under a strict use it or lose it principle.
Use it or lose it.
Meaning, if you didn't fully use your water right for its designated purpose, you risked forfeiting a portion of it. This was a massive disincentive to conservation.
Because saving water meant losing your right to it later.
Precisely. New legislation explicitly broadened the state's in-stream flow program and, crucially, authorized water rights holders to dedicate or lease their water to remain in the stream to flow to the Great Salt Lake without jeopardizing their future water rights.
Oh, okay.
This was a total game changer for enabling voluntary conservation efforts aimed specifically at benefiting the lake.
That use it or lose it change sounds absolutely critical for encouraging upstream users, like farmers, to actually send water downstream.
What about conservation in cities and towns? Was anything done there?
Yes, there was significant investment there too. One major bill dedicated $250 million, $250 million, to fund secondary metering for outdoor water use in municipalities.
Secondary metering, what's that?
It means putting separate meters on irrigation systems, like sprinklers for lawns and gardens, rather than lumping it in with indoor use. This provides homeowners and businesses with much better data on exactly how much water they're using for irrigation, which is often a huge part of urban water use, especially in the West.
Right. And the aim is to use that data to incentivize conservation efforts, make people aware of how much they're really using outdoors.
So policy levers for getting water to the lake, enabling conservation by changing water law, and encouraging urban conservation. What about policies specifically targeting industries or preventing water from being stopped before it reaches the lake?
Yes, there were policies on both fronts. In 2023, legislation was passed that prohibits new wastewater reuse projects in the lake's watershed if they would stop water flow that would otherwise naturally reach the lake.
Okay, so protecting the inflows.
Right. This reinforced the priority of ensuring water actually makes it downstream to the lake itself.
And connecting back to our main focus today, there were significant bills specifically aimed at regulating the mineral extraction industry's water use. That must have been contentious.
This is where the legislation directly impacts the industry we've been discussing, and yes, you can imagine the debates. Bills passed in 2023 and 2024 implemented several new regulations. One, increased royalties on new mineral extraction operations.
Making it more expensive.
Right. And it required them to use technologies that minimize water depletion, explicitly favoring non-consumptive methods like that lithium process we discussed.
Ah, a direct push towards new tech.
Exactly. It also directed state agencies, specifically the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, often called DFSSL, and the Division of Water Quality, DWQ, to establish rules requiring companies to certify that their extraction methods won't actually harm the lake's chemistry or its living organisms like the brine, shrimp, and flies.
So connecting extraction operations directly to environmental impact assessment and favoring methods that use less water overall.
Precisely. Then, perhaps most significantly, building on those initial steps, major legislation in 2024 placed even tighter constraints on the mining industry's water use. It specifically protects water that has been legally dedicated to the Great Salt Lake from being extracted by these companies.
So water meant for the lake stays for the lake.
That's the idea. It also established a tiered tax structure for mineral extraction.
A tiered tax, how does that work?
The tax rate actually changes depending on the lake's elevation, how high the water is, and how much water the company consumptively uses, meaning how much water they evaporate.
Wow. So a tax that goes up if the lake is low or if you use a lot of water? That's a direct financial incentive tied to the lake's health and water conservation.
It is a very direct economic signal. But arguably the most impactful part for operational management, day-to-day, is the requirement for the state engineer's office to develop a comprehensive distribution management plan. Think of it like a detailed water budget for the entire lake system.
A water budget?
Yes. And this plan, which has a deadline of May 2025, will, for the first time ever, set explicit limits on the amount of water extraction companies can take, particularly during critical low water years when the lake is most stressed.
A water budget with limits based on conditions? That's a fundamental change from the historical situation where there were basically no such limits on extraction, right?
It's a huge shift. It's a move from effectively unlimited access to the lake's water to a system of managed access with constraints explicitly tied to the lake's environmental condition. The bill also requires cooperative agreements among the different mineral operators to share resources and manage their water intakes more efficiently, especially when water is scarce.
Interesting.
Now, sources do note there was debate around this specific bill. Some environmental groups saw it as a crucial, albeit imperfect, step forward in managing the industry's impact. Others felt it maybe gave the industry too much certainty about future operations without guaranteeing enough new water for the lake itself. But regardless of that debate, it represents a major shift in state oversight and management.
Looking back at these intense few years of lawmaking, it really seems like an unprecedented level of legislative and financial commitment to the lake's survival.
It absolutely is. And the sources are very clear that this level of change didn't just happen in a vacuum or because one group pushed it through. It required truly unprecedented collaboration and really a united front among incredibly diverse stakeholders who might have previously been at odds.
Like who?
You had environmental advocates like the Nature Conservancy, Friends of Great Salt Lake, Audubon, all working with state legislators across the political spectrum. You had multiple state agencies involved: the Department of Natural Resources, DNR, Utah Department of Agriculture and Food, UDAF, Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, the crucial State Engineer's Office, the new Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office, scientists providing the data and models, different industries, including mineral extraction itself, the agricultural community, which is key, and concerned citizens and local communities all getting involved.
That level of collaboration sounds incredibly challenging, but absolutely essential to get anything done on this scale.
It was, and it is. Groups like Friends of Great Salt Lake, who, have been working tirelessly since 1994 on education, advocacy, engaging in administrative processes, verifying science, even pursuing legal action when necessary. They noted this period with a kind of cautious optimism.
Cautious optimism.
Yeah. They described the effort as a never-ending battle. which probably feels true, but they see a very positive direction if the momentum continues with timely action and sustained collective will. Their active engagement, like, for instance, formally protesting the Waterleaf Resources application for that lithium project.
Right.
That's an example of advocates using the established administrative processes to ensure public oversight and rigorous scientific review of proposed industrial activities on the lake, keeping the pressure on.
So getting the laws passed was one massive hurdle. But the challenge now really shifts to implementation, making these laws work on the ground.
Precisely. While huge historic strides have been made, fundamentally changing the perspective on water in the lake from wasted to valuable, and moving from basically no limits on extraction to establishing a framework for limits, the real work now lies in the details of implementing these new laws, particularly those involving the state engineer's water budget and those environmental certifications from DFFSL and DWQ for extraction methods. Advocacy groups like Friends are, understandably, closely monitoring the rulemaking processes.
And a concept that comes up repeatedly in the sources regarding successful implementation is water shepherding. What exactly is that?
This is absolutely critical, and the sources emphasize it again and again. Water shepherding is essentially the process of ensuring that water saved or conserved upstream, whether by a farmer optimizing irrigation, a city reducing use, or even an industry-changing process, actually makes it downstream all the way to the Great Salt Lake.
Okay.
Ensuring it isn't diverted somewhere else, lost to evaporation from leaky canals, or otherwise siphoned off along the way before it can benefit the lake. Sources state very clearly that without effective shepherding, even the most significant upstream conservation efforts will simply not benefit the lake's elevation or salinity levels. The water won't get there.
So you could save 1 million gallons way upstream, but if half of it disappears through leaky canals or gets taken out by someone else before it reaches the lake, your conservation effort is significantly undermined.
Exactly. And shepherding is technically complex. It's not easy. It requires accurate measurement infrastructure, weirs, gauges, meters across the entire watershed to know precisely how much water is flowing and where it's being diverted at any given time.
Better data.
Much better data. It requires robust accounting models to track that conserved water through the river system. And it requires timely operational adjustments by water managers based on that data. The sources stress that enhanced measurement infrastructure within the watershed is absolutely imperative for the state engineer to effectively track and deliver dedicated water and ensure transparency and shared understanding among all stakeholders. Without this infrastructure, conserved water efforts can indeed be easily undermined, or their benefits simply might not be realized at the lake.
So they've built a strong legal framework with these new laws, but now the hard, maybe less glamorous work of building the necessary monitoring and accounting systems, the plumbing and the ledger, essentially make it all actually work, is underway.
That's a very good way to summarize it, yes. The policies are in place. Now the plumbing and the ledger need to catch up to make them effective.
Okay, let's look ahead then to the path forward. What does success actually look like for the Great Salt Lake? How do we know if these efforts are working?
Well, success involves first restoring the lake to what's considered a healthy elevation range, and then, crucially, maintaining it there over the long term. The Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands has developed something called an elevation matrix.
An elevation matrix?
Yeah, it identifies healthy elevation ranges for over 90 different competing interests associated with the lake ecological needs like bird habitat, recreational uses like boating, industrial needs like mineral extraction access, even aesthetic values.
Okay.
And the state's Great Salt Lake Strike team has cited a specific target level, like 198 feet above sea level, as a key milestone for decision makers to aim for, a sort of benchmark for recovery.
So they have defined goals based on what's needed for the lake itself and all the things that rely on it.
Right. But achieving those goals requires a truly tremendous amount of water inflow. The sources explain this challenge clearly by breaking it into two distinct phases. First, filling the lake back up to a healthy level, which requires a large surplus of water for a sustained period.
Playing catch-up.
Exactly. And then the second phase is maintaining it at that healthy level, which still requires ongoing conservation and management, but maybe at a slightly lower annual volume than the initial filling phase.
And the scale of water needed, particularly for that filling phase, based on the strike team's estimates, it's genuinely massive, isn't it?
It really puts the challenge into stark perspective. The strike team estimated that starting from a hypothetical elevation of 491 feet, remember the record low was slightly lower than that,
Okay.
to reach the target of 498 feet in a relatively ambitious time frame of just 5 years would require an additional inflow of 1,748,000 acre-feet per year.
1.7 million acre-feet.
Almost 1.75 million acre-feet per year extra on top of current flows, assuming continued drought streamflow conditions. Or even under average streamflow conditions, it would still require an additional 1,164,000 acre-feet per year.
Over a million acre-feet of additional water needed every single year for 5 years on top of what's currently flowing into the lake. That's a staggering amount of water.
It is truly staggering. And even if you extend the time frame to a more patient 30 years to reach that target, it still requires an additional 1,055,000 acre-feet per year under drought conditions, or 471,000 acre-feet per year under average streamflow conditions. These are massive volumes of water that have to come from somewhere within the basin.
And where does that water come from? There's no magic source.
No magic source. It has to come from reductions in human water use across the basin. That means conservation from the municipal and industrial sectors, and significant conservation from the agricultural sector, which is by far the largest water user in the basin.
Right.
And critically, as we just discussed, that conserved water must be successfully shepherded all the way to the lake to actually count towards meeting these targets. Saving it upstream isn't enough if it doesn't arrive.
It's so evident from everything you've discussed that there's no single easy solution to filling and maintaining the lake at a healthy level.
The sources are absolutely unified on this point. There is no single silver bullet that will magically cure the lake's ailments. Significant investments are being made in data collection and modeling to better understand the complex system. That's good. But shepherding conserved water is consistently highlighted as perhaps the single most critical operational challenge to making conservation efforts effective.
Yeah.
Restoring the lake is explicitly called a long-term project that will require stamina, patience, and sustained effort from everyone involved for years, likely decades.
And given the reality of growing populations in Utah, already limited water supplies, and the intensifying impacts of climate change, adaptation isn't really optional anymore, is it? It seems necessary for everyone.
That's the stark reality. For individuals, for agriculture, for industry, for communities, everyone who uses water in the basin must adapt to a future where less water is available, or at least less water can be consumed. The sources emphasize that the most important factor for success is continuous, collective will, and the willingness of everyone to work together, even when it's difficult. It will require using every tool in the toolbox, as one source put it, and some new ones, to find and deliver enough water for the lake while meeting essential human needs.
Okay, bringing our discussion full circle now, back to mineral extraction specifically. How do these future challenges and this path forward connect to that particular industry?
Well, the recent policy changes we discussed have fundamentally altered the relationship between mineral extraction and the lake's health. The industry is now directly regulated in ways it simply wasn't before.
Right.
This includes those increased royalties on new projects, the specific limits on water withdrawal that will be based on salinity and low lake levels via that upcoming May 2025 water budget and distribution plan, and a clear state preference now being expressed and even mandated in some cases for non-consumptive technologies, particularly evident in the legislation regarding lithium extraction.
So the industry's operations are now explicitly tied to the state of the lake and subject to defined limits, which didn't exist before.
Exactly. And the ongoing pilot tests of non-consumptive methods, like Waterleaf's lithium project, represent a potential pivot point for the industry. They offer a path towards operations that don't rely on massive water depletion through evaporation if, and it's a significant if, the technology is proven viable economically and, crucially, environmentally safe at scale.
But even with these potential shifts towards new technologies, mineral extraction remains a significant water user, and its future operations are now legally and operationally linked to the overall health and the managed water budget of the Great Salt Lake.
That's the key takeaway. The era of effectively unlimited, unmanaged access to the lake's water for this industry, and arguably for others as well, is intended to be over. It's being replaced by a framework of managed use, contingent on lake conditions, and state oversight.
This deep dive has really revealed the immense value, but also the profound and complex challenges facing the Great Salt Lake. We've seen how this vital ecosystem, critical for millions of birds, global supply chains, local health, was pushed right to the brink of collapse,
Yeah.
leading, finally, to widespread recognition of its irreplaceable value.
And we've explored the intricate interplay of natural cycles, escalating human water demands, the undeniable force of climate change, and the specific water needs of industries like mineral extraction, all contributing to its precarious balance. It's a complicated picture.
But we've also seen the extraordinary response over the last few years, an unprecedented wave of collaboration among diverse, sometimes opposing interests, leading to landmark legislation. These policies are attempting to fundamentally change how water is managed in the entire basin,
Right.
including placing direct regulations and limits on mineral extractions, water use, and, importantly, building the framework to try and ensure conserved water actually reaches the lake.
It represents a significant pivot, really, from decades of what some might call neglect to focused intentional action, spurred directly by the crisis.
However, as our sources consistently remind us, despite these vital steps and the temporary, very welcome reprieve from those wet years, the long-term reality of growing demands and climate change means the lake remains vulnerable. It's not saved yet.
Not by a long shot.
Restoring it to a healthy elevation and maintaining it requires finding and delivering massive amounts of water consistently. It's a long-term undertaking, demanding sustained collective will and adaptation from literally everyone who uses water in the basin.
The hard work of implementation, of shepherding that water, of making the difficult choices about allocation and finding enough water for the future, that work is truly just beginning.
So let's leave you, our listeners, with this thought. Given the complex and often competing needs of a growing population, vital agricultural production, and water-dependent industries like mineral extraction, how can Utah successfully balance all these demands against the undeniable ecological value of the Great Salt Lake and the essential services it provides, like critical bird habitat and breathable air? Can this collective effort, born out of crisis, truly secure a healthy future for the lake? And in doing so, could it potentially offer lessons or even set an international standard for the recovery and management of other threatened terminal lakes around the world, as the strike team report suggested might be possible?
The big question.
And perhaps most personally, what does this massive challenge right here in Utah and the efforts to meet it mean for how you think about and use water in your own life, wherever you might be listening from?
Yeah, the outcome is far from guaranteed. It really depends entirely on sustained focus, continued collective action, and everyone's willingness to adapt to a different water future.